good to be back with you again. As I warned at the end of the last lecture, the model that we had developed at that point was of a very simple argument. There was only one single claim, and the argument was developing sequentially as if in a conversation. Only one point was at issue at a time. But many arguments aren't like that. They're much more complex. There may be multiple claims, all at issue at one time, some of them supporting other claims. And the argument may have to be developed all at once without knowing exactly how an opponent or an audience would respond to it. This would happen in a formal speech, for example, or in a written essay where there's not the back and forth interaction and the speaker or writer has to anticipate all of the possible responses and build them into the original argument. These are arguments that are more complex in nature, and that's the focus of this lecture. In a complex argument, there is one main claim, the one that captures the substance of the controversy, and we call it the resolution. Any controversy could be seen as posing a major question. When two friends get together and talk about interfaith marriages, the underlying question in the controversy is, do interfaith marriages generally succeed? When in a policy-making context, people talk about whether or not the United States should develop a national missile defense system, the underlying question that controversy is trying to address is something like, how should the United States deal with the threats of terrorism? Now, if we imagine an answer to the question that poses the controversy, that answer is what we mean by the resolution. It's the position that one of the advocates in the controversy will defend. It's the ultimate claim on which judgment is being sought. It may be explicitly stated, or it may be implicit in the discourse of the participants, but it should be capable at least of being captured in a single declarative sentence. And like any other kind of claim, there are four different types of resolutions: fact, definition, value, and policy. Implicit in the controversy are certain issues that an advocate will need to defend in order to uphold the resolution. And the subordinate claims that the advocate advances will be answers to those issues. Let me say a bit about issues. The word issue is used very loosely in ordinary discourse. Sometimes it's used to mean any disagreement, as when one person says to another, don't make an issue of it, meaning let's not discuss it. But we have a more precise meaning for the term issue. Issues are the questions that are inherent in a controversy and vital to the success of the resolution. The key terms, obviously, are inherent and vital. When I say that issues are inherent in a controversy, I mean they grow naturally from it. If we were to ask the question, do interfaith marriages succeed, we would be led naturally to a series of other questions. What counts as an interfaith marriage? What do we mean by success? How will we know whether or not it succeeds? And so on. Those are inherent in the larger controversy. And if we had a resolution that interfaith marriages generally fail, in order to sustain that resolution, we would have to be able to speak to and answer those issues. They're vital to it. If we can't answer the issue satisfactorily, then we can't sustain the resolution. So, issues are inherent in the controversy, and they're vital to the success of the resolution. Now, at this point, let me take just a moment and put together the relationship among controversies, issues, resolutions, and claims. If you're following on video, you might want to look at this chart that I'm going to describe, where we could imagine one box that I have at the upper left labeled controversy, and then an arrow pointing to another box at the upper right that's labeled resolution. This tells us that from the controversy, we derive the resolution. The controversy poses the question. The resolution is an answer to the question that one of the advocates will seek to defend. Then, going down from the controversy, there is an arrow that leads to a series of boxes, each of which I've labeled issue. Each one of these boxes is a question that's inherent in the controversy. It grows out of the controversy. And the answer to those questions? To the right of each of those issue boxes, you could draw an arrow to a box and label it claim. And that would be a statement that would be made to answer the issue. The claims respond to the issues grow out of the controversy. And those claims taken together lead back up by an arrow pointing up on the right side of the chart to the resolution. So the issues grow out of the controversy. They're answered with statements or claims that are vital to the success of the resolution. That then is the relationship among these four key terms: controversy, resolution, issue, and claim. Of course, not every issue will be contested. Some may not be in dispute. The parties might agree to them. And so we can say that potential issues minus the uncontested issues will yield the actual issues in the dispute. Let's consider an example to see how the issues work. In February of 2003, then Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the United Nations Security Council seeking approval for military action against Iraq. He was defending a policy resolution, which we might state as the Security Council should authorize the use of force in Iraq. His speech was long, it was 16 pages long in print, but if we read it carefully, we'll see that he's addressing a controversy. Does Iraq pose a threat to world peace? The resolution answers the controversy, and we'll see that he examines the following four issues. First, is there a problem? His answer is yes, and the claim he advances is Iraq is developing weapons of mass destruction which it might put into the hands of terrorists. A second issue he examines is, what is to blame? And his answer, in the form of a claim, Saddam Hussein has violated United Nations resolutions and the UN has not enforced them. Third issue he takes up, although only briefly, will the proposal solve the problem? He says, yes, it will either destroy the weapons or remove the government. And finally, number 4, on balance, will the proposal be better? And Secretary Powell's claim is yes, because it will remove a threat to peace in the region and it will bolster the credibility of the UN. Now, I should make clear, Secretary Powell does not label these issues in the way that I have just done. But if you read his speech and examine what he's saying, you will see that in that speech, he develops responses to these issues. The issues grow naturally out of the question of the controversy, does Iraq pose a threat to world peace? And these are issues that he's got to answer successfully in order to sustain the resolution that the United Nations should authorize the use of force. Now, we'll consider later how Powell developed his arguments and how well he defended them. But for now, notice how he applied the theory that we've been describing. The controversy gives rise to a series of questions. These are the issues to which Powell responds with claims that, taken together, support the resolution. Now, let's consider how complex arguments, like Secretary Powell's, are organized. The organization of complex arguments is also complex, but there are 3 basic patterns. I'll describe each and show you a model of what each looks like. The models highlight the relationship between individual claims and the resolution. Of course, each box in these models containing a claim is also part of an argument for which there is evidence and inference and a warrant, as we discussed last time. But these diagrams would get far too complicated if we put in all of those elements again. So let's just remember that each one of the boxes we're about to see could be blown up into the model that we discussed last time. So what are the three basic patterns? First, complex arguments can be arranged in a series structure, sometimes called by writers a subordinative structure. This is like a series circuit in physics, and that's where the analogy comes from, or like the old-fashioned Christmas tree lights, where if one of the light bulbs goes out, the whole string of them goes out because the current passes through each one successively. Each one depends upon all the others. And that's a characteristic of the series structure of argument. Each claim leads to another in a chain, and each one depends upon all the others if the claim is going to be established. For instance, let's suppose that the resolution that we want to defend is the claim, airline mistakes cost me my job. And we ask, how are we going to defend this resolution? Well, here are our subordinate claims. First, my luggage was mistagged when I went on a business trip. Because it was mistagged, it was sent to the wrong city. Because it was sent to the wrong city, I did not have valuable documents and papers that I had packed in my luggage. Because I was missing those documents and papers, I gave a poor presentation in the city where I was being sent by my company. And since I gave a poor presentation, I was fired from my job. Now you see here how we have a classic series structure. Every step depends upon everything that's happened before it. If we could break one of the links in the chain, we'd break the whole chain of argument. So each claim leads to another, each depends upon the others, and all of the arguments must be carried in order to carry the resolution. You might think, therefore, that this is a poor way to organize arguments. But consider this. The series structure also creates a kind of momentum where each one of the steps pushes you forward toward the next step. So that if you think you can carry the series, you get some extra force from the cumulative kind of momentum that the series structure generates. But that's one way that we could organize a complex argument in a series pattern. A second pattern, we could organize our arguments in a convergent structure, sometimes called a coordinative structure. Now here's the difference between convergent and series. Remember, in series we said each argument depends upon the others. In a convergent structure, each argument is independent of the other arguments. Each claim stands on its own, but like the series circuit, it's the totality of the arguments that converge to establish the resolution. That's why the structure is called convergent. The arguments don't depend on each other, but we need their cumulative weight to support the resolution. Let's consider this resolution. Airline travel is becoming more unpleasant. Now, that's the main claim that we want to establish, and we've got a structure of subordinate claims that will establish it. For instance, we have one claim that says flights are often delayed. Another one says planes are really overcrowded. Third one says the airlines don't serve food anymore. Fourth one says airport security after September 11th is really obtrusive. Another one says airports have become tense places where you really can't relax anymore. Another one says more passengers are rude these days. Another one says people are always using their cell phones and you have to overhear their conversations. And all of these things work together to support the claim that airline travel is becoming more unpleasant, the resolution that we're trying to defend. Now, one of those supporting claims by itself might not be all that significant. We might dismiss any one of those things as a minor nuisance, not really a signal of unpleasantness. But if you put them all together, if you have delayed flights and crowded planes and no food and tense airports, you have all those things together, their convergence supports the resolution that airline travel is becoming more unpleasant. And then third, arguments may be arranged in a parallel structure, sometimes called a multiple structure. Again, the analogy is to physics. A parallel circuit is one in which the current passes through, and if one light goes out, the rest of them stay lit. Each stands on its own. Each argument is independent of the others, just like in the convergent structure, but unlike the convergent structure, each one by itself is sufficient to carry the resolution. So this time we might imagine a diagram where we've got a group of boxes, each representing an individual claim. We've got a resolution over here, and each one of the boxes independently has an arrow going from it to the resolution, because each one by itself would show that the resolution's probably true. Consider this example, still about airlines. Here are our different claims. Airline prices don't make sense. Airline schedules are inconvenient. Connections are often missed. To obtain discount fares, you have to buy tickets way in advance before knowing the details of your plans. Websites and online reservations are confusing. Reservation agents don't respond well to questions. Those would all be claims supporting the resolution, airline travel is difficult to plan. Now, in this example, each one of the claims by itself establishes that travel is difficult to plan. If prices don't make sense, it's hard to plan. If the schedules are inconvenient, it's hard to plan. If you can't make your connections, it's hard to plan. If you have to buy your ticket too early, it's hard to plan, and so on. Each one separately and independently helps to establish the resolution. So we have the three basic organizational plans for complex arguments: series, convergent, and parallel. Now let's go back to Colin Powell's 2003 speech and see how he organized his arguments. I warn you, this is a complex argument, and so it has a complex structure. If you're on video, you might follow this diagram. If you're in your car, please don't stop now to look at the outline. Check it later. First off, if you notice across the top of the chart, the main argument that Secretary Powell is making is developed in a series structure. The resolution he's defending is at the upper right. The Security Council should authorize the use of force in Iraq. How does he get there? Well, follow his argument. He says, Iraq was required by the UN to disarm. Then, Iraq cannot prove that it's done so. Then, this creates a dangerous situation. And then the UN has an obligation to enforce its resolutions. Therefore, the Security Council should authorize the use of force. It's a series structure because each one of the steps depends upon the ones that have come before it. It wouldn't matter whether Iraq could prove that it's disarmed its weapons of mass destruction if the UN hadn't required it to do so. We wouldn't be in a dangerous situation if we weren't unsure about whether Iraq had given up its weapons. The Security Council wouldn't need to authorize the use of force if there weren't a UN obligation. There wouldn't be a UN obligation if the situation weren't dangerous. It's arranged in a series. And if you thought before that a series is an inherently weak structure, think again, because what this series does is it creates the sense of momentum for Secretary Powell's argument. But now notice something interesting. As he develops each one of the steps in that chain, several of them are developed with a parallel structure. For instance, look at the second step up at the top. Iraq cannot prove that it's disarmed its weapons of mass destruction. Secretary Powell gives you two separate arguments, independent of each other, but both supporting that. First, that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction programs are continuing, and second, that Iraqi denials can't be trusted. Each one of those by itself is a reason to conclude that Iraq cannot prove that it has disarmed its weapons of mass destruction. And now for added measure, each one of those two is independently supported by three arguments in another parallel structure. So how do we know that the weapons of mass destruction programs are continuing? Well, the Secretary argues biological weapons are continuing, chemical weapons programs are continuing, nuclear weapons programs are continuing. Each one of those by itself separately would prove that Iraq is continuing its WMD programs. And Iraqi denials cannot be trusted is supported by three separate independent arguments. Iraq hides things from the inspectors, Iraq submits useless documents to mislead the UN, and Iraq won't permit interviews of scientists outside the country. Each one, separately and by itself, is a reason to conclude that Iraqi denials can't be trusted. So this argument that Iraq can't prove it's disarmed is supported by parallel structures, which in turn are supported by other parallel structures. Now look across the top line at the next step. This creates a dangerous situation. Secretary Powell has another parallel structure. Two separate reasons why it's a dangerous situation. Because it flouts, it defies the international authority of the UN, and because weapons of mass destruction could be given to terrorists. Each one of those is a reason for concluding the situation is dangerous if the UN's authority is questioned or if terrorists obtain weapons of mass destruction. Look at the next step across the top. The UN has an obligation to enforce its resolutions, another parallel structure. It's got an obligation, first of all, to preserve its own credibility, its own relevance, as Secretary Powell said. And second, it's got an obligation because the risk will only grow. And if it doesn't act now, the threat to peace will be even more serious in the future when terrorists may get access to the weapons of mass destruction. So look what we've seen so far about Secretary Powell's argument. His mainline argument is developed in series structure, but almost every one of the steps is in turn developed in a parallel structure. Now notice one more thing. Let's go back to the weapons of mass destruction programs, biological, chemical, and nuclear. Every one of those claims that Iraq's developing biological weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, every one of those claims is supported by a convergent structure. Look at biological, for example. Secretary Powell says Iraq has been producing biological weapons in the past. It can't account for their destruction, and it lies about what it's doing. Now, those three arguments are independent of one another, but they work together. They converge to establish that Iraq is producing biological weapons. The fact that Iraq has done so in the past wouldn't be enough by itself. The fact that you can't prove that old weapons have been destroyed wouldn't be enough by itself. The fact that Iraq is deceiving the inspectors wouldn't be enough by itself. But put together, they converge to establish that Iraq is developing biological weapons. The very same arguments, the very same convergent structure are used to show that Iraq is developing chemical weapons. And with respect to nuclear weapons, there's again a convergent structure. Iraq has some parts already, is trying to get missing parts, and is developing the weapon systems to deliver the weapons. So notice what we see in Secretary Powell's speech. We see a complex argument that uses all of the organizational patterns and combines them in ways to create a map of the argument that I've represented in this diagram. Now again, I hasten to point out, Secretary Powell doesn't have a chart like this. He doesn't proceed in exactly this order, and he doesn't label his arguments. But we can. And when we do, we can understand what he's doing in this argument and how it gets put together. Of course, what we've done with Secretary Powell's speech, you could do with any newspaper editorial, op-ed column, or any other example of an argument. We identified the resolution, we figured out the issues, we diagrammed the structure of the argument, and then if we wanted to, we could go back to the last lecture, and within individual arguments, we could show the evidence and the inference and the warrant as well as the claim. Now, why should we do that? Why should you practice this kind of argument diagramming? Well, it enables you to understand what's going on in the argument. Most of us who didn't read Secretary Powell's speech and didn't diagram it out have only a soundbite or two to go on to figure out what he really said. We could actually diagram it and structure the argument out. Also, understanding what Secretary Powell did is the first step to enable us to appraise the quality of his argument. Now, Secretary Powell's speech has been criticized in the aftermath of the failure to find weapons of mass destruction. Did Secretary Powell make a mistake because, in fact, the weapons didn't turn up? Was his argument poor? Or was his argument good and reasonable, even though the weapons didn't turn up? Well, to answer that question, we have to be able to know what he argued and how he went about it. And that's what we gain by diagramming the argument. We also are able to start thinking about alternatives. What if Secretary Powell had not separated out biological, chemical, nuclear weapons? What if he had not used a parallel structure for why the UN has an obligation to enforce its resolutions? What if he had not grounded the main line of his argument in a series structure? And we could go on and on and on with each one of the steps of the argument. We could imagine alternatives, other ways to do it. And then for practice, we could figure out what each of us might do, confronted with the particular situation of the argument that we're examining. Now, I know few of us are ever going to have the opportunity to address the UN Security Council. But if you do this with a letter to the editor, or an editorial in the local newspaper, or a conversation that you've had in your family, the same process works just as well, and we can get some real insight into the nature of the arguments. In other words, I'm suggesting that being able to model and diagram complex as well as simple arguments is highly useful for pedagogical purposes, as a way to teach ourselves about argument. You should know that there are some theorists who object to this whole process of diagramming arguments. They say that it gives the arguments a mistaken linear quality, that there's really not this clear progression. And indeed, if you go back and read Powell's speech, he doesn't progress clearly in the way that I've described. And so they say it's misleading to try to diagram the argument this way. They say that diagramming is an analytical exercise only, and it shouldn't be confused with actually building the arguments. Well and good. Well and good. We can accept that there are limitations to the diagrams, but there's a great value that they serve, and I think we've seen how they serve the value in the example that we have described. In addition to enabling us to analyze arguments, these tools are also useful when we build our own arguments, and we'll take up that topic next time.